My name is Julie Womack. I am the head of organizing for Red, Wine, and Blue. Red, Wine, and Blue is a community of over 600,000 women across the country who are working every day to defeat extremism in their communities. We know that we're about 2 weeks away. Tomorrow marks 2 weeks when we have the election, and we still have a lot of work to do. But I know some of us are doom scrolling. Some of us are out there phone banking and texting and knocking doors and talking to our friends and family. We are all trying to get stuff done. That's why we are so thrilled to have Heather here to kind of like talk us through this, help ease our anxiety. She is so good at doing that. We need everybody doing everything they can up and through Election Day to get this over the finish line. But first, we are going to have an amazing conversation again with Heather Cox Richardson. I think this is like our 8th or 9th event with Heather, and it is always a pleasure to have her here. I know most of our members tell me that they wake up every morning to read Heather's Substack to get the information that they need to know to start their day. I know that that is what I do. And so I think without further introduction, we're going to get this conversation started. Hi, Heather.
Julie, it's so much fun to be here. I always love doing these.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And I know you've been busy and traveling, so we really appreciate your time. Um, so the last time you were here, we were doing a lot of conversations about Project 2025. And we know now that at the time that there were a lot of people who had never heard of it, but we really accomplished our mission because now the majority of Americans have actually heard about Project 2025 and they don't really like it very much. Um, and so I know that we are making a difference by what we're doing, by having these conversations, by going out and talking to family and friends about things like Project 2025. So Heather, I know that, like I said, you've been on the road supporting candidates who will protect our democracy this year. You've been all over the place. And you're not talking just about candidates for the US Senate, but you've also been really focusing on state Senate and state houses. So can you tell us a little bit more about like what you're seeing in your travels and how you are feeling?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is important to recognize going into this election and future elections is that the extremist candidates consider that they have done their job when they vote the entire way down the ticket for their candidates. Whereas people who are interested in more reasonable government tend only to vote for those races that they think that they have adequately researched themselves. So actually we have quite high what's called roll off. That is, people vote for one or two races and not all the way down. And I would say that in this election, we must unlearn that behavior and vote all the way down the ticket. So what I have seen, and this is only anecdotal, of course, I'm not actually pulling from numbers, is really interesting because I have been now for a year on the road talking to people about democracy, and I've worked very hard not to be in blue states, to go to swing states and to go to Republican states. And I believe with all my heart that we are in the middle of a movement. And it's a movement fueled by people like Red, Wine, and Blue, fueled by people like the ones that are in my community. Those of us who really care about democracy and care about governance that works for all of us. And what's interesting to me about that is that the people who are in our communities, like people like us, tend to be invisible. They're not the people that are getting highlighted by legacy media, for example. And so, people always say to me, "Oh, why do you have hope?" And my answer is, look at us. I mean, we're up to 6,500 people on this phone call, and we're not done. They're still flocking in, and think about it. Would you have done that, all of you people here, 10 years ago? And the answer is no. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. And I think that there is a giant that has been awakened. And when that happens in our country, and it happened in the 1850s, it happened in the 1890s, it happened in the 1930s, when that happens, we change society. So I remain concerned about many things about this election. It is not a done deal. We need everybody out there knocking on the doors, but think about it. If just the people who listen to Red, Wine, and Blue turn 10 people each out to vote in this election, and you have 600,000, I can't do the math, but that's a lot of people who are important to have around. So I think I'm seeing a movement, and I'm happy to talk more about that. I just think it's a really interesting moment because I don't think people are aware of just how profoundly this country has changed in the last 8 years. And I don't mean like the people in it have changed necessarily, but the people who are making a difference and who are stepping up to the plate are entirely different. And I think it's going to matter a lot on November 5th.
Well, absolutely. My math's not that great either, but even on this call, we had like my eyes aren't great. So I'm looking, it's like 6.6 thousand, that's 60,000 voters plus that you guys can reach. And we know how narrow these margins are for some of these races that, that that are going to make and break this election. So you guys have so much power in your hand. And you're right. I think the local organizing is not getting recognized by the mainstream media and all the efforts that are going on. So can you talk a little bit, just kind of following up on that? So you did all this traveling, you talked to people everywhere. Why did you make the local races a priority?
Well, local is so important. I mean, that's first of all, local is where like the school boards are and the town governments and the things that really matter in our lives. But the local government is also the feeder to the state governments. And in this moment, when the radicals in the Republican Party have worked so hard to devolve power to the state level, what happens at the state level is crucially important because that's where you're getting anti-abortion laws. That's where you're getting all the rollbacks of environmental laws. That's where you're getting all the really day-to-day stuff that matters in your state. And what the plan is, of course, from radicals is rather than having to convince anybody at the congressional level to do something, simply to do it all the state level, where it's so much easier to get a monopoly on the state government. So one of the places I've spent a lot of time is in North Carolina. And my goal there has not been to win North Carolina. It's been to break the gerrymandering that has created a supermajority of Republicans so that they can override the vetoes of the Democratic governors who are elected at a statewide basis. And I think that's within their grasp. They're working very hard to do it. And I know that one of your own, Kate Barr, is somebody that I'm going to be highlighting going forward. She is running in a district that she cannot win because it is so heavily gerrymandered. And her whole campaign, I think, really represents what so many of us are trying to do. Her campaign is Kate Barr can't win. And she's doing it really to call attention to democracy and to the fact that we shouldn't have to live under these laws where electeds get to pick their voters rather than voters picking their elected officers. So I think the local offices matter so much, the state offices matter. And then, of course, the federal offices matter a lot as well. But as I say, we got to be voting the whole way down this year in every single election.
Could you talk for a minute? Because you mentioned the ballot roll-off, and we do talk about that. I know Sister District did a study on the impact that people not actually voting all the way down ballot, how that could, impact a state legislatures. Like we lost chambers because people just failed to vote. I was curious if you had any more to say on that ballot roll-off or anything else you want to say about your travels or what you were seeing on the ground.
Well, I do think it's interesting that I know about the ballot roll-off too, but I thought it was just sort of like everybody did that because they felt that they couldn't vote for an election for a case for a contest where they hadn't personally done the research. I used to do that. And then when I learned from political scientists that in fact the extremists consider their civic duty to vote all the way down, and the people who are trying to create the kind of governance that I think Red, Wine, and Blue is talking about only do the elections that they have personally researched. I'm like, we have a structural problem here. It'd be lovely if we all did the exact same thing, but until we do that, we got to make sure we're voting all the way down the ballot as well. I thought that was a really, really interesting distinction. And in terms of the country as a whole, one of the things that I think is really important about Red, Wine, and Blue and about what I do and about what so many other people are doing is that, you know, I really have been on the road. I mean, I can't even do the math now. And I've been all over the country. And I will say one of the things that really jumps out is how small this country is. And I don't mean that geographically, and I certainly don't mean that in terms of the number of people who live in it, the 332 million people who live here. But every place I go, the people that I talk to are nice people. They're decent people. They want the same things that you and I do. They want decent schools. They want to be able to put food on the table. They want a place to live. They want safe communities. And they really do care about their neighbors. And one of the things that I think Red, Wine, and Blue does, and that I hope that I do, is make the world a little bit smaller. So you recognize that the people that I talk to in North Carolina are really the exact same as the people I talk to in Montana, or the people I talk to in Texas, or the people I talk to in Ohio. And that we really are a decent community of people who wants to do the right thing. And we've been bitterly divided, I think, by politicians who knew that their route to power was only by dividing us. So I have real hope that if we can get by this moment, we really can create a new America that answers a lot of the problems that many of us have felt were not adequately answered for the past 40 years.
Absolutely. And I hope that everybody listening to you tonight too, talking about the local races and the down ballot races and the importance is that that's one way you can make a huge difference is by making sure your friends and family who don't do their research so they stop voting will actually fill out that entire ballot because it really does have a humongous impact. Now I know there's a lot of things that we're, anxious about, things we're excited about. The news cycle can have you up and down all the time. But we have heard a lot of worries about voter suppression. In 2023, the GOP led legislatures introduced 566 laws to suppress the vote, making it harder to vote. And we've seen secretaries of state, I live in Ohio, purging voters, off of the rolls, removing registered voters, people who are, you know, should be able to vote, but are now seeing barriers to that. Can you give us a little sense of like, have voter suppression tactics always played a role in elections, or is this something new that we're seeing?
So that's a great question. And it's worth remembering that the moment in which we are finding ourselves now actually really takes off in 1986 during the Reagan administration, because there's really something very basic at work here. And that is that Americans like a government that regulates business, make sure our water and air is clean and that employers don't get all the rights, that provides a basic social safety net so that grandmothers don't have to eat out of trash cans. That's actually how we got the social safety net we have is during the 1930s. A guy looks out his window and sees elderly women eating out of the trash cans in the alley behind his where he lives. And he says, we can't be like this. They like infrastructure. We like it when our bridges don't collapse and when we have roads to get places. And we like the protection of our civil rights. We actually like all those things. Well, when Reagan takes office in 1981, he is in the process of slashing those regulations and slashing the social safety net, as well as slashing taxes, which is what he had been elected on. And by 1986, they recognized the American people don't like that there's no guarantee that they're going to continue down that road of what's known as supply side economics. That is the government focusing on the supply side, the people who have the money, rather than the demand side, consumers. So in 1986, they begin the process of what they call ballot integrity. And that's the idea that they must go through the rolls and purge them of people who are not legitimate voters in order to secure the vote. And when they do that, there was a lawsuit over it, and they actually write memos in which they say, well, this should kick a lot of Black people off the rolls because they're expecting that Black Americans are voting for Democrats. That's 1986. And then when Bill Clinton gets elected, after he's elected in 1993, the Democrats passed what we know as the motor voter law. And the motor voter law made it easier to register to vote, which in a democracy you would think people would want. But as soon as that happens, Republicans begin to say that they are losing elections only because the Democrats are cheating with illegal voters, largely immigrant voters. Now, we know everybody will tell you that voter fraud is extremely rare, because if you think about it, it's a really big risk to take for very little payoff. So we really don't have voter fraud in this country. What we do have and have had in the past is election fraud, when somebody tries to steal an election through things like voter suppression. So the voter suppression that you're identifying now comes out of this early period, and then during the 1990s, when there's this talk of getting, purifying the vote, of worrying about voters voting illegitimately. In 1998, there is after a terrible election in Miami, in which, by the way, there were no Democrats running, the the election for the Miami mayor is just completely corrupt. And what happens on the heels of that is the Florida state legislature passes a measure to purge the voting rolls. And they purge about 100,000 names off the rolls right before the 2000 election in Florida. And of course, that's the election that came down to the hanging chads and the eventual difference of about 527 votes. Not 527,000, but 527 votes. And with that, of course, we get the election of George W. Bush instead of Al Gore, the Democrat. And that idea of voters choosing their representatives kind of goes out the window when you recognize that you can start peeling off different voters so that the elected officials can choose the people that vote for them. And then from there, we get this increasing focus on purifying, as they say, the vote. But it really takes off again after Barack Obama is elected in 2008. And we get in 2010 what's known as Operation Red Map, which is the Republican Redistricting Majority Project, which is the idea of taking over those state governments so that the redistricting will dramatically favor the Republicans, which is how we get things like the North Carolina supermajority in what is essentially a 50-50 state. So that has always been there really in America since 1986. It is now supercharged. We now have people fighting back against it. But the mirror that we need to be using here is that we had voter suppression in a really dramatic way in the American South from about 1874 to 1965. And in that period, the suppression of the Black vote and their white allies in the Republican Party and in splinter parties at the time was so extreme that we essentially ended up with a one-party state in the American South in that period. And one of the things I like to point out is the reason that the South was so backward in those years is because, money wouldn't come down there. Nobody would invest in a new factory because you didn't know if it was secure or not because of this one-party state that could do whatever it wanted. And nobody's lives were secure. Certainly Black Americans' lives weren't secure. Brown Americans' lives weren't secure. Women's lives weren't secure. And also the white men who were not in the same faction as those in control were not secure either. So this idea of creating a one-party state has happened in America before. It's certainly happened in countries like Hungary and Vladimir Putin's Russia. But what that spells is extraordinary insecurity for everybody in the country. And I just turned that into a lecture, but that's really the entire story of voter suppression in the United States in however many minutes that took me. So I'm sorry about that, but it was pretty thorough.
It's okay. You know what? People read your Substack because they want to learn, and I think we would all love to be in one of your classrooms, so we appreciate that. I do want to bring on Jasmine Clark now, who is a state representative in Georgia, and we know there's all kinds of election shenanigans going on there. Jasmine is also a Georgia mom, a scientist, and she is the co-host of the Red, Wine, and Blue podcast, The Suburban Woman Problem. And she's I think I said this, but she's a state legislator in Georgia. Jasmine, welcome.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
So,
Good seeing you.
I think you had a question of talking about some concerns about challenging election results in Georgia and some things they're trying down there.
Yeah, so I just want to first say thank you so much, Heather, for all of that wealth of knowledge. As a college professor, I'm sitting here like nodding my head, like, yeah, she is speaking. And so I want to talk a little bit about what's going on down here in Georgia. Republican operatives down here have been trying to change the rules to empower political challenges to the election results. So, you can't win one way, they try to win another. We know why they're doing this. They know they will lose if they play fair. So right now we are kicking butt when it comes to early voting numbers, and so that scares them. So what challenges do you expect to the outcome of the election if Trump loses? And what are the challenges you anticipate? What are the challenges you anticipate at like the state and local level as well as the federal level? And do you think that we are prepared as a country to deal with them?
Is that a question for me or for Julie?
Oh, that's for you.
Well, it's not for me. It's not for me.
You're the expert.
Well, I'd actually love to hear what you have to say about that in Georgia. because it seems to me there's absolutely no doubt that the Trump campaign has never tried to win voters. It has always tried to whip up violence. You can see this with their rejection of Nikki Haley voters. You can see this with his constant calls that his enemies are, that the Democrats are the enemies within. This is clearly the strategy, and I think the strategy is to create enough messiness in the states that it will be hard to certify the elections in those states. But here's what I wonder. He's been trying to do this since he left office. And
Correct.
remember, he wanted people to turn out for him for his indictments. He wanted people to turn out when he was convicted. He wanted people to turn out on that convoy that went down to the southern border. And he
Yes.
got about 19 F-150s, and I can do better than that in my grocery store parking lot. So I'm not entirely sure that with the government in the hands of Joe Biden, that he will be able to turn out the kind of violence that he is talking about. So do I think we're prepared? I think it is really interesting that nobody is talking about that.
Yeah.
Because do you honestly think nobody is preparing for that? As I always try to game the other side of the table. I don't know. That's not my field, but I cannot believe that with this extremely talented group of attorneys general around the country and people in the Department of Justice and certainly in the White House, that they do not have a plan, because we know what's coming. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know here in Georgia, what he has tried to do is basically use our state election board to do what you were just talking about. Sow discord, sow chaos, and things like that down here in the state of Georgia. He called the three unelected, appointed extremists on our state election board his pit bulls, and basically had them introducing all these different rules that would basically allow different election boards to decide, because we have 159 of them in the state of Georgia, to decide whether or not to certify the elections. They've tried a couple of times. They did a couple of test runs in previous elections of trying to not certify the election, just to see what happens. A judge here has ruled that certifying the election is not an option. It is a requirement. It is mandatory. Then they tried to say, oh, well, we'll just implement all of these rules that have to happen on election night. And if you don't do them, then, then you're out of compliance and all of these different things. And a judge said, the election is underway. Like, you cannot do this right now, which scares me because he didn't say you cannot do this. He said you cannot do this right now. And if I know anything about Republicans, they are okay with playing the long game. So that still worries me a little bit. But yeah, altogether, I would say that down here in the state of Georgia, they are trying all the suppressive tactics they can. At the same time, though, we are overcoming a lot of that suppression. It's not to say that there's not still some things going on here. For example, we had ballot drop boxes in 2020, and those ballot drop boxes were used by so many Georgians to turn in their absentee ballots. Remember, this is a time we're in the middle of a pandemic, so a lot of people didn't really feel comfortable voting in person, so they voted on a ballot, turned it into a drop box. So many people used them. It was so effective that within a year, like the next legislative session after that election, they pretty much obliterated drop boxes. They exist, but they exist in a form that actually makes them completely useless at this point. So the tactics are there, but I feel like people in Georgia, and I feel like this is happening across the country, they're saying, despite all of the things and in spite of all of the things that you will try to do, we are going to still show up. And that is giving me hope here in Georgia. Now, as far as are we prepared, I think that there are judges that are ready to, follow the law and interpret the law in the correct manner. But I don't know. I guess we'll see what happens on, election night and thereafter.
I just like to add that one of the things I always talk about playing the other side of the table. You don't take away the drop boxes if you think that people want the policies that you're advocating. You don't suppress the vote if you think what you're doing is popular. You don't try and shut people up if you think that they're going to be speaking for you. You don't lie about, you don't go out there and lie about all your policies if you think people actually want them. And that's something I hope people hold very close to their hearts, because one of the things that will come out of this election is that, things are not over on November 6th. If indeed this
Absolutely.
is a movement to take back our democracy, there's a lot of stuff we got to fix. And some of it is going to be making sure that the mechanics of our democracy actually reflect the actual desires of the people in it. Because the fact, for example, that we haven't been able to get common sense gun safety legislation when 80% of Americans want that is bonkers. 80% of Americans don't even agree to like chocolate, right? So the idea that we all can agree on that, but we can't get it through our Congress, is a real problem. So one of the things that I think is really important when you look at what a huge effort there is to lie to people, to make sure they can't vote, to take away the drop boxes, to do all the things that we're seeing, is that's because of very few people who are in positions of power know that the majority of Americans don't like what they're doing and want to get rid of them. And we got to use that power that we have to take our democracy back.
Absolutely. I could not agree anymore with that sentiment. If they did not care about your vote, they would not try so hard to block your ability to get to that ballot box. So your vote absolutely positively does matter, and that's why we have to show up.
Well, Jasmine, thank you so much for everything you're doing down there in Georgia, fighting the good fight for us. We appreciate that. I know you have to jump to something else because you're busy. You got a lot going on too. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks
Good
so
to
much for
see you,
having me.
Jasmine.
Good to see you, Heather. Good to see you, Julie. Bye, everybody.
So I do want to point out how there were up to we were up to 7,000 people on this call, which means everybody, that 10 people, are you guys going to commit? Can you please say yes in the chat if you will commit to talking to 10 of your friends, making sure they have a vote plan, because that is 70,000 voters we reached just from this call. Heather, let's talk a little bit about October surprises. Are you expecting any kind of October surprise
Oh my God,
here, or?
we've had it. We've
Okay,
had
tell us
it.
about it, and tell us
So
how we should be feeling about this.
So I'm glad. Yeah, I'm seeing all these yeses. This is great. Um, so we are not talking about nearly enough about the fact that the Republican candidate for president, he is gone. His mind is gone. So if you think about what it takes to be the president of the United States, this is one of the things that used to bother me when people, rooted on Joe Biden. Like, he was managing foreign affairs and putting through all these landmark pieces of legislation, and doing this and doing that. Trump couldn't do anything in his first term. Now look at him. He's canceling stuff. He's falling asleep at his own events. He just went, he clearly has no filter left, which is a sign of dementia. And people are pretending as if this is okay. And I'm looking at that aside from anything else. I mean, he could be the candidate that I want more than anything. And I'm looking at that and thinking, I literally know how much a president does in a day, a real president does in a day, and I couldn't do it. I know that I am not in good enough physical shape to do it. Um, and then people want to put him in charge of that. I mean, the sheer amount of stuff you need to read during the day to be on top of things, because I've actually participated not ever in writing or reading a president's daily brief, but in the occasions when I've met the president, you have to give material for the president's people to put in the daily brief. And it's not like a haiku. I mean, you're putting a ton of material in there because it's a way of looking at everything that's happening in the world and in the president's daily event, daily calendar. And Trump can't sit through one of his own events. And I'm looking at that and thinking, how are people missing that this is the story? Because even if he is elected, he's never going to be president. J.D. Vance is going to be president, which means that Peter Thiel is going to be president, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. And I cannot, I keep writing about it because, listen to me, I'm completely inarticulate here because this has never happened before. We've never had a president who was gone. And, I was trying to think about this the other day. Maybe Nixon at the end, when he was drinking so heavily that his aides, didn't let people see him. But this is headline above the fold news. And because it's Trump, I think people are not putting it there. And the idea of putting somebody like that in charge of the nuclear codes is it's one of the most dangerous things, aside from everything else. It's one of the most dangerous things ever in our history. And I'm sort of gobsmacked that it is not. The Boston Globe has made it headline news, and other people are talking about it, but this is like screaming red flag headline news.
Yeah, I think that's frustrating for a lot of us because we see it. I mean, that isn't that why Kamala Harris says watch his rallies, right? It's like she wants to, I think they're turning it into ads because she wants to get that coverage to show what unfortunately they don't think the media is highlighting enough of, what he actually says, or sometimes they clean it up a little bit when they play snippets or try to explain it. I don't know if you agree with me on that, but I sometimes feel like they try to explain away what he's saying or doing at his rallies or at his speeches. Um,
Well, and I do say I caught myself doing it once because you're trying to find out what's happening, and I cut something. If you read me, you'll know there was a day a while back now where I posted an entire thing exactly verbatim. I took it myself from the clip. I literally transcribed it myself from the clip, and with the help, as usual, of my fabulous copy editor. And I did that because I had started to clean it up to make a point. And I thought, I'm working at it. I'm thinking, well, maybe he's saying this. And then I thought, no, I'm doing it now too, because I'm trying to make sense of it. And I'm trying to do it for my readers, but that's a disservice. They need to see that this makes no sense at all. And so I've started to do that, giving him as he is. But it's hard because your instinct is to sort of say, wait, I'm listening. Tell me that a little bit more clearly. So I think in a way it almost plays against your good instincts.
yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's a great point that you are doing that. And as a historian trying to report stuff, and it's just an innate, I think, thing that people like, oh, let me make this make more sense for my readers. And that's not actually helpful because we're not seeing the reality then. So let's get into what to expect on election night. Can you tell us when was the last time that a presidential election was actually decided on election night?
That's the great way to put it. I don't know. I don't know when the last time was. I know this one won't be. I mean, the only time it is if it's a early landslide, which is certainly within the realm of possibility. For Harris, I don't foresee any kind of an early landslide for Trump. And I will tell you, one of the things for those of you who are nervous that I have been watching is the way that Trump allies have been talking about this election. And Nick Fuentes, if you know who he is, he's a white nationalist. He actually did a show today that presupposed that Harris would have a 4-year term. And that was not his point. His point was pure fascism, but he started from that premise, which does not sound like a victory speech to me. But aside from that, we have ballots coming in late. We have ballots across the country. I don't expect to know anything that night. I hope I will know. I would say in the first couple of days. But remember, what we're waiting for is those ballots to come in, which is one of the reasons that people like us are urging people to vote early so that your vote is banked and counted. Although not every state counts, some by state law cannot count early. And that's why there's a later wave, a later blue wave. And that is, of course, what Trump weaponized in 2020 and knew he was going to weaponize in 2020. So, I'm planning to hide under my desk. But whatever you hear that first day or so, let it go, unless it's a definitive early win for Harris.
Well, actually, you gave me a great segue into the fact that every state does things a little bit differently. I want to bring up Sherry Luce, who is our Red, Wine, and Blues program director in Pennsylvania. She's involved with election integrity there, and obviously Pennsylvania is just kind of an important state in this election. And Sherry, maybe you can explain a little bit too, just about how she has taught me this because I live in Ohio, that Pennsylvania can't even open absentee ballots or people who mailed in ballots until the morning of the election, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong on there, but I also know you have a question for Heather. Sherry.
That's 100% correct. Here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we do have vote by mail without reason. So anyone can request it until October 29th or go into their voter registration office or voter services and request their ballot right there, complete it, and submit it. But the problem we had in 2020 is we're not allowed to even begin to open those envelopes until election day at 7 a.m. So you've got like over 1 million sitting there that we cannot begin to process and scan through the machines. And that's what happened in 2020 when Donald Trump went to bed believing he was ahead in Pennsylvania, but then overnight more ballots were dropping because they were finally being processed. And it switched. And that's when they started to scream fraud. It gets very frustrating because it's happening again. We've had to fight to keep drop boxes in certain counties. It's been a little bit of a nightmare, but I'm happy to report as of today, over 920,000 people in Pennsylvania have already had their mail-in ballot accepted at their county level. We're at about 65.2% toward what people consider to be the firewall for a Democratic victory, but that number is in flux and changing. It's been fascinating to watch, and I will throw in a quick little thing here. Tomorrow night, Pennsylvania is hosting a virtual event to talk about trends and registration and voting if anyone wants to join. But my question to you, Heather, is why are states so different with all the rules and regulations? And how does this timing impact the overall results coming out?
It's crazy, isn't it? You know, it's so many of the things we have are holdovers from very early on in our system when states got to determine their voters. And that's always been a problem because what happened was at first it's a convenience thing in a way. I mean, that you didn't want to have a strong federal government running the voting system because you were very concerned in those days about a demagogue or a king or a dictator taking over this democracy. And so you wanted to make sure things were as spread out as they could be. That's why we have the Electoral College, is because they're hoping to make a system whereby the people who elect the president will not be beholden to the president in any way. They meet briefly, they can't be office holders, and then they disappear again, right? That's the plan. But what happened very quickly was that the states which ran their elections, and of course, in the early days, the government doesn't even print ballots. It's actually the parties that print the ballots. What happened very quickly is that the states got to decide who could vote. So you see this nowadays when you get this voter suppression at the state level. Quite literally, the idea behind the voter protections that we got in the 20th century, first in the 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, and then in the 20th century, were designed to guarantee that the states could not discriminate among voting the way that they do. But of course, since we had the gutting of the Voting Rights Act with Shelby versus Holder in 2013, they have done that in a pretty dramatic way. And one of my favorite things about that is the state of Texas, which permits you to use your hunting license to vote, but not your student ID. I mean, there are all sorts of ways that you can adjust the people who can vote and can adjust IDs. So for example, saying, as the attempt was under the SAVE Act that was at the federal level that Trump was trying to get through, that your birth certificate had to match the ID with which you voted. Well, of course, that was described as a way to hurt trans people. It also knocked most women out of voting as well, the women who had changed their names when they got married. So there's all sorts of ways in which the states can mess around with who gets to vote. It's this holdover. And as I say, one of the things that I would love to see going forward after the election is an enshrining in our Constitution of the right to vote, and true federal legislation, like was introduced in the beginning of Biden's term, to protect at the federal level the right to vote in the states, because that ability of the states to be hotbeds of extremism by picking your voters and gerrymandering is doing us all a huge disservice.
Agree.
Absolutely. I'm in Ohio. We have issue 1, so we are trying to fight gerrymandering here because, we are very gerrymandered, and I definitely see the results of that in terms of what I know people in my state want to see happen, like gun violence prevention, Heather, and it just never gets any traction. So, Sherry, thank you for all you're doing and for
Thank
joining
you.
us. And, Pennsylvania, hang in there. Heather, I would like to ask you, there was a new PRRI survey out that found that 19% of Republicans say that if Trump loses, that he should declare the results invalid and just do whatever it takes to assume office. And 3 in 10 Republicans believe that violence would be justified. Do you expect another January 6th if Trump loses?
Like I was saying, I really don't. Of course, I'm a prophet of the past, not the future, but I was watching that very closely after January 6th, 2021 and the riot at the Capitol. And because, that was obviously what he was trying to do. And it is clearly what he is trying to do again. And he's not alone on that, by the way. You have Michael Flynn's Renew America tour or whatever it's called. There's a lot of people out there calling for violence, trying to rile up violence. But the Department of Justice went after, if you will, the low-hanging fruit of the people who participated in January 6th. And so far, I think more than 1,000 have been indicted. I don't remember, it's somewhere around that. I think about 950 or so have either pleaded guilty or been found guilty by a court and a jury. And that the reason I mention that is because they went into January 6th expecting first that they were going to win, and second that Trump was going to protect them. And now they're sitting in jail. And that stuff is a lot harder to pull off another time when you don't have the person you're supporting in the White House to support you with the military as they expected he would do. And when you know that your compatriots who did that in the past are in jail. And so, one of the things we talk about when we talk about the Confederacy is the fact that after the fall of the Confederate States of America in 1865, nobody was punished. There was no punishment for having participated in that. And that was an excuse, if you will, to say, well, I'll just do it again. I mean, they tried to put some guardrails up, but they never really punished the people who had participated in that. And that, I think, was a big mistake because it made it seem as if your cause was still worth pursuing in the future because there wasn't going to be any cost for having embraced it. Interestingly enough, when the Department of Justice goes after the Ku Klux Klan members in 1870, the KKK goes underground for almost 50 years because nobody wants to go to prison for they can privately hate without going to prison, and that's what they decide to do. So I always worry about things. We are a violent society. We have too many guns in the streets. But that's not something I'm losing sleep over. I could be absolutely wrong, but the signs that I was looking for, people turning out for his indictment, people turning out for his trial. Remember, he kept saying they're closing off the streets because there's so many people here. They weren't. Nobody was showing up. And then the trucker convoy, I was really watching that because that's one of the things that managed to topple the Chilean government in 1973 and installed Pinochet. And that was the convoy that kind of stopped everything and whipped up a lot of support. And they, of course, had done that during the worst of the COVID pandemic. And when they basically tried to go down to the border and they ended up getting sidetracked off into a religious revival and everybody got angry and went home, I thought, this is not looking like a movement so much as like a bunch of people who are trying to pull something off and not succeeding. So I'm less worried about it than I would have been if those signs had been different.
Actually, thank you. That's a really great point about the fact that people are getting punished for it. And you kind of saw I think I've seen a lot of news articles about the people being punished and they're kind of surprised they're being punished. And then other people recognizing that, wow, he doesn't really have our back and not showing up for his trial 100%. Just curious. So when the election results are final, kind of wanted to think about like, what will you be thinking if it's a good result, if it's a bad result, and regardless of the result, isn't there work that we really need to all still be doing?
So this is a very odd moment, I think, in America and in our lives because it is not a normal election. Donald Trump has promised to overturn American democracy, to put the civil service, the military, and the Justice Department all in his control. So it is subservient to him. Those have always been nonpartisan. They have always been civil servants and people who were who answered to the Constitution, not to a president. He's vowed to get rid of that, and he has vowed to put in place a dictatorship that will impose Christian nationalism on us. I am extremely unnerved by his constant repetition of the idea that there are enemies within, and that is the Democratic Party, because that's language that we've seen before. Hitler used that. And what that is doing is, I think, opening up the way for a purge of political opponents. And you see people like the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, talking about how he expects to go to prison. I think you can make a list of people who would be in real trouble if Trump is elected. So on the one hand, we have that. On the other hand, we have, as I say, this new movement. And it's a movement that older people like me are certainly putting our all into and are getting behind. But it is primarily of young people who see the world in a very different way than people like me see it, by virtue of the fact they've grown up in a different world than I have. And those two things in this election, both of them have coattails. So on the one hand, if we are to go down the authoritarian route, there are many things that we can expect will happen, but we certainly will see people who are continuing to try and protect American democracy. On the other hand, we will see people who are trying to rebuild American democracy. And this is one of the reasons that I'm fighting so hard for this, is because if you think about what would happen if we took all the talents that we have unearthed in the last 8 years and applied them to the things that we care about in the next 10, we have an entirely new country. So one of the things that I really am pushing for everybody who's here and who's interested in this movement is to recognize that your talents really need to kick in even stronger after November 6th, after we take a bit of a break. Because one of the things that I think that people who care about progressive democracy have done in the past is thought that when they won an election, things were over. And one of the things we must understand is that democracy is never over, that it is always something in which we have to be involved. And not everybody has to do it all the time. Right now, it's all consuming, but we must stay engaged to rebuild the kind of American government that can take on climate change, that can take on world pandemics, that can take on inequality, that can take on the migration that we are facing because of those other three things. And in order to do that, that's going to take everybody's efforts and everybody's brains and hard work. And I will point out that for all that we're exhausted and for all that we're frightened, and we should be, one of the things that I see around me is extraordinary creativity and excitement and new languages and new books and new music and new art and new ways of thinking about government and new ways of thinking about interacting and new kinds of advertising and fun and new enthusiasm for the democratic project that I really haven't seen. People point to 2008, but this feels to me even bigger than that. It feels like the post-World War II years, when there really was this sense that if we came together as Americans, we could do anything. And I have never doubted that. And what we've seen in my lifetime, my adult lifetime, is the splintering of that belief, both through the lack of political rhetoric that emphasizes it, but also through a series of politicians who have risen to power by dividing us and turning us against our weakest members. And if we can get beyond that, and if we can hold on to that we going forward, I think about the future we could have, and it is something obviously I can't see the contours of, because as I say, it's not really my world, but I think of that and I think of the joy and the excitement of that. And our great gift that we get to be part of that we get to defend American democracy the same way that Dr. Hector Garcia did, or Fannie Lou Hamer, or even Abraham Lincoln, that we get to do this. We get to do this. I think that the future could be extraordinary. There is joy in the work. And I hope we all carry that forward, because it's going to be one hell of a lot of work for the next 2 weeks. And then it's going to be a lot of work going forward after that. But it's a gift as much as it's a reaction of fear. It's a gift that we have the opportunity to do this and that we get to do it together.
Absolutely. And I think you're singing the red, white, and blue song because that's what we want is we want people organizing across the country. That is what happens when you start local groups. You find your people who think like you and who become your great friends, but you also accomplish so much together. And you need to have that group of people. And it can be so inspiring and so empowering. As you talked about earlier at the local level, like making that difference there and just continuing, we're going to continue to do that work even after the election. So
Well, doesn't Red, Wine, and Blue have this rally tool? I was hearing about this out in North Carolina or somewhere.
yes, we do. And in fact, I would love, as we talked about the after parties we're going to be having, you guys have all committed. You all were saying yes in the chat. I saw that chat going quickly to talking to 10 friends. Well, we have a tool that actually helps you be way more effective at it because it gives you messaging and script and information to send to those friends. It helps you make a vote plan, and it is called Rally. So it will help you do all of those things, help you track your friends. You'll be able to see who's already voted, who hasn't, who's got that absentee ballot sitting on their counter that you need to nudge them to turn that back in. And it also will be here year round. It will help you going forward with like sending information that your friends need to know. So how does that sound to you, Heather? Does that sound like something
Well,
people should?
it's my understanding that that does not give your friends information to anybody else. It's just your way of building your squad and making sure people get out. And it's also for all the um, I have not been trained on. I was just listening to the woman I was working with in wherever I just was, and it's for all the states. It's not just the states where Red, Wine, and Blue is most active, right?
Right, it's a national program, everybody can get involved, and, yes, 100%, that's what we're gonna be doing in our after parties. We're gonna be talking about how you get involved with that, and I hope everybody here is committed not to miss out. We are gonna help you reach those 10 friends or maybe even more. So what we're gonna do now is I'm gonna give Heather just, like, to share her final thoughts, anything that you haven't said that you wanna share with us, and then we're gonna get you all set up in the after parties.
Well, the one thing I would say is what we do know is relational organizing is the most effective thing you can do, talking to your friends, talking to people you know. But I just would go back to this idea that this is our moment, that this is our election. Like there are people who came before us and they fought their own fight in the summer of 1964, for example, or in 1860, or in the 1890s. This is ours. This one belongs to us. And, if you'd said that to me 10 years ago, I would have thought, oh my God, I can't handle this. But we now know how to do it. We have the tools, we have the squads, we have the communities, and honest to God, I think we have the numbers. And what we don't have, which I kind of think is a superpower, is we don't have a lot of attention on us right now, which means we can do a lot to move the needle without having to do it on the cover of a major legacy media newspaper. I'm not going to give any names here, but you probably think what I have in mind here. So let's do this. So we got 2 weeks. Let's take it out for a spin. Let's do it. This is our election, up and down the ballot, and put our names in the historical record the same way as those people that we've read about our whole lives.
Okay. Well, I know that after listening to everything you've said tonight, I feel much less anxious. I feel much better. And I am excited to see so many people on this call who are committing to talking to their friends and to getting involved. So now you're right. We have 2 weeks. It is time to do the work, and that starts right now.